Imagine you are a physicist facing a criminal trial.
Okay.
But instead of, sitting there quietly while your defense attorney quotes legal precedents and argues case law, you stand up and defend yourself using the principles of quantum mechanics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, quantum mechanics, complex network theory, and, behavioral psychology.
I mean, that is just the ultimate collision of worlds. You have the cold, empirical, mathematically sound logic of statistical physics crashing headfirst into the very rigid, often entirely subjective machinery of a courtroom.
Exactly. And that is the exact real-world scenario we are exploring in today's Deep Dives. Our mission today is to navigate this truly fascinating stack of documents we've received, specifically the Grok documentation analyzing the case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan.
Right, the independent scholar.
Yeah, he is a scholar of nonlinear complex systems who literally wrote a document called the Prism Blood Letter. And in it, he scientifically and mathematically dismantles his own criminal conviction from inside a prison cell.
It's just a remarkable, unprecedented text. We are essentially looking at a synthesis of law, advanced physics, and cognitive psychology, all weaponized as a tool of self-defense.
It really is wild. Now, before we jump into the mechanics of how he actually did this, a quick note to you listening. Because our source material today contains politically charged content involving both left-wing and right-wing elements, we want to make it absolutely clear to you that we are not taking any sides.
Right, absolutely.
We are impartially reporting on the content provided and are not endorsing the viewpoints of the original source material, but simply conveying the fascinating ideas it contains.
Yeah, our sole objective here is just to decode the architecture of his argument. So to set the stage for you, Dr. Chen was arrested and convicted in China of a charge known as picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
Which is quite the name for a charge.
It really is. And the action that triggered this charge was retweeting academic, historical, and political content on a Twitter account. But the crucial detail, the data point that sets this entire defense in motion, is that this account had fewer than 100 followers.
Less than 100.
Less than 100. And the sources indicate many of them were likely inactive bots, meaning his actual engagement was practically zero.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why a physicist felt forced to abandon a standard legal defense and use network theory instead, we first have to look at the bizarre legal sandbox he found himself trapped in.
Right.
The sources highlight that Dr. Chen's constitutional rights were allegedly violated right out of the gate. We are talking about Article 35 on freedom of speech, Article 33 on equality, Article 41 on the right to complaint, and Article 47 on academic freedom.
That's a lot of protections.
Right, he had all this protection on paper, yet he was still sitting in a cell.
Which brings us to a structural concept the sources identify as the dual-track constitution.
The dual-track constitution.
Yeah. This is the idea that a legal framework can function almost like two parallel operating systems. The first track is incredibly solemn and perfect on paper, guaranteeing all these fundamental human rights.
But I'm guessing the second track isn't so perfect.
Exactly. In practice, the system defaults to a second shadow track. It just bypasses the formal constitution entirely through the use of what are called pocket crimes.
Pocket crimes. It's essentially a catch-all charge, right? I mean, it reminds me of a building inspector who ignores the actual structural blueprints of your house.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like they bypass all the zoning codes you followed
Yeah.
and just decide to condemn the property because they personally don't like the color you painted the front door.
Yeah.
They just use a vague, localized rule to override the whole foundational architecture.
That is a highly accurate analogy. Picking quarrels and provoking trouble is historically recognized as a pocket crime. It's designed to be used arbitrarily when the formal legal structure just doesn't support a conviction. And in Chen's case, the prosecution accused him of spreading false information and causing a serious confusion of public order. But the burden of proof for those massive claims was entirely absent.
Absent is almost putting it too lightly, honestly. The documents note that Prosecutor Jebin actually admitted in court that he, and this is a quote, didn't verify and doesn't plan to verify if the information Chen retweeted was actually false.
What's fascinating here is that lack of empirical legal evidence is the exact catalyst for Chen's defense. I mean, legally, for a charge of serious confusion of public order to stick, there has to be a quantifiable mechanism of disruption.
Right, like did it cause a riot? Did local commerce stop?
Exactly. But the prosecution provided zero quantitative data, no retweet counts, no impact assessments, just this abstract label.
Which forces you to ask, how can a person with almost zero followers, engaging mostly with bots, mechanically cause a serious confusion of public order? I mean, the fundamental causality just doesn't exist.
It really doesn't.
So if the state refuses to provide the data, Chen realizes he has to provide it himself.
Yeah.
He recognizes he cannot win a legal argument in a system that explicitly ignores its own legal texts. So he shifts the entire battleground to a domain where the rules cannot be rewritten by a judge.
The laws of physics.
Exactly, the laws of physics.
He takes this highly subjective legal accusation like, you disrupted society, and translates it into a physical, testable hypothesis using the mathematical structure of the internet itself.
Right.
Dr. Chen applies a concept called scale-free network theory. And to understand the brilliance of this, you have to visualize how a social media platform like Twitter is actually constructed. It's not a neat, even grid where everyone has a similar number of connections.
No, not at all.
Right. Instead, it follows what physicists call a power law distribution.
So the architecture of the network is incredibly asymmetrical.
Extremely asymmetrical.
Right.
In a scale-free network, the structure relies on a tiny handful of massive hub nodes. Think of, giant influencers, major news outlets, or government accounts with tens of millions of followers.
The heavy hitters.
Yeah, these hubs are the structural pillars holding the network together. But the vast majority of the network, like over 99% of it, is made up of edge nodes or peripheral nodes. These are just regular, everyday users with very few connections.
And Chen, with his following of less than 100 inactive accounts, is the absolute definition of an edge node.
Yeah.
I mean, he is existing on the extreme microscopic fringes of this network.
Which allows him to bring in the foundational mathematics of percolation theory. He cites the critical threshold formula, which was developed by physicists Reuven Cohen and Shlomo Havlin back in the year 2000.
Oh, okay.
And this formula proves that in a scale-free network, if you randomly remove or alter edge nodes, it has mathematically zero impact on the overall connectivity of the network. Physicists refer to this as the giant component.
Here's where it gets really interesting. So by applying this formula, he is proving that the crime he is accused of committing is mathematically impossible. If we think of the internet as a massive, intricate vascular system, the hubs are the major arteries pumping information to millions of cells. Chen is a single microscopic capillary at the very tip of a fingernail.
Right.
The court is essentially arguing that a slight change in pressure in this one microscopic capillary caused the entire body to go into immediate cardiac arrest.
That perfectly illustrates the concept of network robustness. The math demonstrates that scale-free networks are hyper-resilient to random edge node fluctuations. You could wipe out thousands of edge nodes simultaneously, and the network would continue to function flawlessly.
Because the information just routes around the missing nodes, right?
Exactly. However, these networks are highly vulnerable to targeted attacks on the hub nodes. If you remove or disrupt a few massive hubs, the entire system fragments and shatters.
Which means Chen flips the entire accusation on its head. He is arguing that the judicial system itself, acting as this immensely powerful institutional hub node, is the actual disruptive force. By arbitrarily arresting citizens and ignoring its own constitution, the hub is attacking the structural integrity of the network from the inside.
Exactly. He uses network topology to show the court that they are the ones introducing chaos into the system.
But, I mean, a structural map of a network, even a scale-free one, is ultimately just a static picture. It shows us the roads, but it doesn't show us the traffic. What happens dynamically when a piece of information is actually injected into that structure?
Well, that is the exact transition Chen makes. He moves from the static architecture of the network to the dynamic physics of information spread.
Yeah.
He utilizes the framework of self-organized criticality, often referred to as SOC, and avalanche dynamics. These are concepts introduced by the physicist Purbach.
Avalanche dynamics. So we're looking at the mechanism of how one isolated event triggers a cascading failure. In social media terms, this is like the physics of how a single post goes insanely viral.
Correct. In statistical physics, the spread of information is modeled as a branching process. When one person sends a tweet, That is the initial node. If two people retweet it, those are the branches.
Makes sense.
Right. The average number of new branches or retweets that each subsequent post generates is called the mean branching factor. In the math, this is denoted by the letter M.
So for a cascade to actually become an avalanche, to create that serious confusion of public order, the state is so afraid of that mean branching factor M has to be strictly greater than 1.
Yes, exactly.
Every single retweet must, on average, generate more than one additional retweet just to keep the momentum going.
Yes. But because Chen is an isolated edge node, surrounded mostly by bots who do not interact, his branching factor is much, much less than 1. In physics terminology, his action occurred deep in the subcritical zone.
So it's mathematically dead on arrival.
Pretty much. To solidify this, Chen applies the Galton-Watson extinction theorem. This theorem proves that if your branching factor is less than 1, the probability of your information cascade dying out completely is exactly 1.
Meaning it is a mathematical certainty. It is not just highly unlikely that his tweet caused a disruption. The Galton-Watson theorem proves it is an impossible event.
Right.
The prosecution fundamentally confused a micro-fluctuation, a single unseen piece of data, with a macro-phase transition, like the boiling of an ocean or the collapse of a society.
Which is just a massive category mistake in statistical physics.
But let me push back on this for a second on behalf of anyone listening who might be thinking about chaos theory. What about the butterfly effect?
Oh, the butterfly flap.
Yeah, the famous idea that a single flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil can set off a tornado in Texas. If complex systems are highly sensitive to initial conditions, couldn't Chen's one tweet theoretically be that butterfly flap that sets off chain reaction, regardless of his follower count?
It is a critical question, and it's actually one Chen specifically anticipated and refuted in his defense.
Really?
Yeah, the butterfly effect is frequently misunderstood in popular culture. For a microfluctuation, like a butterfly flap or an unseen tweet, to cause a massive phase transition, the entire system must already be hovering at a hyperfragile state called the critical point.
So the environment itself has to be primed for destruction.
Precisely. Think of a mountainside loaded with thousands of tons of unstable snow. If a single skier snapping a twig causes a massive avalanche, the twig didn't possess the kinetic energy to destroy the mountain.
The mountain was already a disaster waiting to happen.
Exactly. It was in a supercritical state. The twig was merely the trigger. If Chinese society was in such a supercritical, unstable state that a single unseen tweet from an edge node could collapse public order, then the tweet is not the fundamental cause of the collapse. The inherent instability of the system is the cause.
And legally, if the system is that fragile, you cannot hold the individual responsible for the structural integrity of the entire society. The sources point out that this aligns perfectly with Article 16 of their criminal law, which exempts individuals from criminal liability for unforeseeable causes that are beyond their control.
So Chen really corners the prosecution with their own logic here. Either his tweet was mathematically incapable of causing an avalanche, which means he's innocent,
Right.
or society was already so structurally compromised that his tweet merely triggered an inevitable collapse, which means blaming him is legally invalid anyway.
Wow.
It is an airtight, rigorous defense that forces the court to look at the concept of causation through the unforgiving lens of thermodynamics.
It's a brilliant logical trap. But the fact that he built this trap implies something darker. His mathematical proof only works if the opposing side speaks the language of logic.
Yeah, that's the catch.
The fact that the judicial system rigidly ignored this mathematical reality and convicted him anyway forces us to ask a completely different question. What is the psychological machinery driving this system, and how did Chen's mind survive being ground inside it?
This raises an important question, and it's where the source documents provide a really fascinating pivot into psychology. Because physics explains the network, but psychology explains the humans operating it. Let's look at developmental psychology, specifically the work of Erik Erikson.
Okay, Erikson.
Yeah, Erikson proposed that the primary psychological task of midlife is achieving a state called generativity.
Generativity, that's the drive to create something that outlasts you, right?
Yeah.
To contribute to the next generation rather than stagnating.
Exactly. And the documents analyze how Chen successfully achieved this generativity as a cognitive survival strategy. By taking his immediate personal trauma of being imprisoned and transforming it into this exhaustive, cross-disciplinary prison bloodletter, he shifted his cognitive focus.
He reframed his whole reality.
He really did. He wasn't just a victim suffering in a cell. He became an independent scholar documenting a historical aberration for future generations. He manufactured deep psychological meaning out of his suffering.
While the judicial system, conversely, is described as being trapped in a stage of rigid, conventional conformity, they lacks the capacity for self-reflection. And this really comes into focus when the sources apply the Big Five personality traits to both sides of this conflict.
The contrast is striking, to be honest. According to the analysis, Dr. Chen exhibits extremely high openness to experience. In a high-stress environment, this doesn't just mean a preference for variety. It means possessing a high tolerance for cognitive complexity, ambiguity, and multiple perspectives.
You can see the bigger picture.
Right. His brain is flexible enough to detach from the physical reality of a prison cell and view his own trial as a fascinating data set to be analyzed. He also scores incredibly high in conscientiousness. I mean, the meticulous self-discipline required to draft a physics dissertation from memory under duress is just unreal.
And the institutional machine prosecuting him operates on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. The sources suggest the judicial officers displayed very low openness.
Yeah, extremely low.
When a bureaucracy is under immense pressure to maintain control, it narrows its vision. It loses cognitive flexibility and defaults to rigid, blunt force labels, like those pocket crimes we talked about, because it literally cannot process the nuance of the real world.
Exactly.
This manifests as high neuroticism. They react to a complex reality with anxiety and authoritarian force rather than investigation.
It is the classic structural clash. A highly fluid, adaptable human mind trapped inside a rigid, closed, bureaucratic machine. And this leads us to the behavioral psychology aspect of the analysis, which examines the system's attempt to extinguish Chen's behavior.
Right, because the state essentially treats its citizens like subjects in a behavioral experiment. They assume human behavior operates like a simple light switch. If someone is doing something you don't like, you apply severe negative punishment, and the switch turns off.
That's the theory.
They locked him up, isolated him, took away his platform. So what does this all mean? Why didn't the switch turn off?
Because the system completely misunderstood the mechanics of human motivation. There is a psychological concept called resistance to extinction. The system assumed Chen was driven by extrinsic rewards like money or fame or social clout.
Right.
If you take those away, an extrinsically motivated person stops the behavior.
But Chen wasn't getting paid to retweet academic articles to bots.
Exactly. His behavior was driven entirely by intrinsic motivation, the internal, unquantifiable joy of intellectual discovery and academic curiosity. Furthermore, if you are listening to this and wondering how a habit becomes so unbreakable, you have to look at the reinforcement schedule.
Okay, the reinforcement schedule.
Yeah, Chen had been pursuing this independent scholarship for 20 years on an intermittent reinforcement schedule.
Let me jump in here because intermittent reinforcement is fascinating. It's like a scientist looking for a completely new subatomic particle. 99 times out of 100, the collider yields absolutely nothing. It's a dead end. But it is that tiny, unpredictable 1% possibility of a breakthrough that keeps them in the laboratory until 3 in the morning. You cannot punish that drive out of someone because the sheer irregularity of the reward is exactly what makes the hunt so deeply compelling to the human brain.
That is a perfect analogy. When a behavior is deeply rooted in intrinsic curiosity and has a decades-long history of intermittent reinforcement, it becomes virtually impossible to extinguish with blunt force trauma. You can put him in a cell, you can take away his computer, but you cannot turn off his neurological drive to analyze complex systems.
In fact, by punishing him, the system didn't stop a criminal. They just gave a highly conscientious physicist a brand new, incredibly flawed, complex system to analyze the justice system itself.
They inadvertently provided him with the ultimate case study.
They really did. To step back and look at the sheer scope of what we've covered today, we have walked through the story of a man who used the topology of scale-free networks, the Galton-Watson branching process, and the Big Five personality traits to intellectually dismantle his own prison sentence. It is a staggering display of human resilience.
It really is a testament to the enduring power of a rigorously trained mind.
Oh, and earlier you mentioned the CAP theorem in passing.
Right, the CAP theorem.
Yeah, it ties right into this. Just as a distributed computer network has to choose between consistency, availability, and partition tolerance, Chen showed that a judicial system can't simultaneously maintain absolute control, legal consistency, and adapt to a massive network society. Something has to break.
Wow, that's so true. And the reason this matters to you listening to this right now is that Dr. Chen's story is a wake-up call about the world we all live in. Think about the networks you interact with every single day. We are all edge nodes in massive, complex digital and social structures.
We really are. We are all subject to rules and laws made by massive institutional hubs. But often, those institutions have absolutely no understanding of the underlying science of the systems they govern. They write linear laws for an exponential networked reality.
And if we connect the physics back to the reality of our social structures, it leaves us with a deeply provocative thought. We know from the source material that complex social systems naturally hover in a delicate balance between order and chaos. And Chen proved mathematically that targeting harmless, low-level edge nodes is completely useless for maintaining structural order.
Right, because the microscopic capillary doesn't control the heart rate.
Exactly. But here is the paradox we are left to mull over. What if the intense, rigid effort by those powerful institutional hub nodes to perfectly control every single tiny fluctuation? What if their relentless drive to punish every edge node out of fear of disruption is the exact force that accidentally pushes the entire society into a catastrophic, supercritical avalanche?
So by obsessively trying to present the avalanche, the hub becomes the dynamite.
Basically, yes.
It brings us right back to that physicist standing in the courtroom. He wasn't just defending himself. He was holding up his calculations, pointing to the math, and warning the very system judging him that they were the ones breaking the laws of physics.
A warning written in a prison cell, echoing through the network.
A brilliant mind refusing to be extinguished. That's all for today's deep dive. Stay curious.